Yes, it was fabulous. Oh my God. That is stuck in my mind all these years. Yes. Yes. How many years ago was that?
It would have been 8 years ago, almost
8.
7.5 years ago.
Yes, say over 8 years.
Okay. Yeah, he was incredible. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Well, he was something.
Share screen.
Are you gonna?
We're looking forward to hearing you and Sonia.
Let's look at the settings right
Well, thank you.
I think if you have it like that, they can.
Okay.
The Weinbergers are here today.
Hello.
Yes, we are.
How are
Don't
you?
you make a good host?
Oh, I can't take this call. Hey, how is your grandchildren in Chicago?
You talking to us?
Yeah.
And what did you say? I missed it.
How are the grandchildren in Chicago? Don't they live? Where do they live? Do they live where our grandchildren live?
Where do yours live? Where?
In Deerfield.
No, not at all. They're in Geneva.
Which is about an hour west of Chicago.
Oh, okay. I don't know why I thought they.
They just got a new puppy, so they're very happy.
Oh, I'm thinking of the Berkowitzes. Their son lives in the same town as our son does. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Would have had a bar mitzvah in June, but that's going to
I hope.
happening.
God willing, right?
No, it's not going to happen in June.
Oh, it's not. Oh. Well, it'll happen.
It'll happen.
They have time. They can still do it.
Illinois is not doing well.
No, we just asked our son that last night. Yeah.
He's just been extended to May 8th. In Pennsylvania, it's just been extended.
I know. We heard that today. We heard that.
Yep.
Kids are slattered all over the place.
Uh-huh.
Debbie Goldberg.
Yeah.
Call me later. Deb. Deb, where are you? What happened to you?
Yeah.
Call Joan later.
I was on silent. I will call you.
Okay. Hey,
Okay.
Paul. I see you at every Zoom meeting, huh?
Yeah, I've been going pretty regularly.
I liked yesterday a lot. Danny, that was good.
Very interesting.
Yeah, it was. It was well done. Yeah.
Can you? I don't have.
I'll get us started.
Here we go.
Okay.
There we go.
Hi, neighbor.
Yes.
How you
Hi,
doing?
neighbor Carol.
I
Adler.
see you. I'm waving to.
There is nothing wrong with your microphone. You have all been muted. It's not just one person. You have all been muted. So if you can hear, give us a thumbs up. That's it. Okay.
Good.
And welcome. Here we'll unmute Tybee just to make sure we can hear her for a second. Tybee, can we hear you?
Me?
We can.
Good,
And where's
good.
Sonia?
Y'all?
Oh,
They're
in there
the same
somewhere.
screen.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
they're at the
Fine.
same place.
So
Okay.
it is 3:02. We are live streaming.
So we are so happy you all are here, and it's so interesting. Different First Mondays bring out different people, and we're really happy and honored that you all are with us. And we are honored and happy that Tybee and Sonia are with us. And in honor of Yom HaShoah, which is tomorrow, we are so grateful that Tybee and Sonia are here with us to share their parents' and grandparents' story. I know that we were honored to have them come to the religious school and speak with us, and they were both incredible people. So we're just really honored. And what's going to happen, so you know, what's going to happen is that Tybee and Sonia will share a little bit of their parents and grandparents' stories with us. Some pictures. If it doesn't work, you can let us know, Tybee, and we can share it. And if you have a question for them, you can send us a chat to us privately, and then we can go ahead and ask on your behalf. And Tybee said she doesn't mind at all. So please feel free, if you have a question for them about the story, please just send us a question. And at the end, we will light a candle together and say a short prayer. So that's how it's going to go. And I'm going to turn it over. And I'm just really grateful and thankful that Tybee and Sonia are here.
We're going to be using a spotlight video as well. It seems to work better for the live streaming purposes. There are some people who cannot get on Zoom and are watching it on television. So what'll happen is, if you don't know how to use Zoom yet, you like to see all those little faces, you want to go into gallery view. That's some symbol on our screen. It's on the top corner, a little grid. But if you like to be in speaker view to see the speaker and to see the screen when we start screen sharing, you might want to be in speaker view. So what's going to happen now is I'm going to spotlight Tybee and Sonia. Okay, Tybee, you are now big. There you are. Okay, and you are spotlighted. We can hear you. And without further ado.
Well, thanks for inviting me, and thanks all of you for joining. This wasn't actually a big deal because it's not like I was going anywhere today, other than to Sonia's house. Unfortunately, she's going to try to move some old slides that we have and some pictures. So bear with us as we kind of figure out how to. She knows how to do it. I
You have
don't.
no faith, Mom.
So I'm going to.
Too. If you have trouble, we've got this. We have the PowerPoint up as well.
So again, Rabbi Amy asked me to again recount my dad's story, and I went back to a very old version, the first version he wrote when he must have been about 70 years old. So the story that I want to tell is not only his remembering of what happened to him when he was in his late teens, but also the story and my thoughts about his story today might be different than I would have thought they were 10 years ago, because we think about things and hear things a little differently. Anyway, many of you who knew my dad thought of him as a gentle man. That remark was made to me many times, but he really wasn't. Believe it or not, growing up, we thought of him as very hard. His expectations were high. And when you hear a story, you can understand why. And we didn't hear the story till we were much older. But in the unedited version, he starts his story by saying, "It happened to me when I was 18, 19, 20. I've lived with the story for 50 years. Man against man, man for man. The choice was man's." And I never saw that before, which is a stark realization, but he really did try to choose, or he thought about himself as choosing his way through this story. At least he remembers it. He was born in a shtetl called Shkudvil in 1922 in Lithuania, where all the men were rabbis. And in addition to their other trades, life in Shkudvil really centered on their Jewish observance and learning. But on Tuesday was market day, where Lithuanians came and there was a lot of trading and so forth. And Dad, do you want to? And Dad recalls climbing trees and going fishing and really living as a rather idyllic life. He was the youngest of 5. He had 3 older brothers who had emigrated. That's my grandfather, my dad's dad. And Sonia's then going to show his mother, who unfortunately was not around to raise him. I think she died at the time of his birth or shortly thereafter. This was the family that remained in Lithuania after his older brothers went to South Africa. The little boy in the front is my dad. That's his sister who raised him and her husband that she's showing. And again, that was his sister, his brother-in-law, and his little niece, all of whom perished. And that was their house in Shkudvil, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later. Why don't you go back? Okay. And his older brothers, when he was young, had emigrated to South Africa, which was typical for Lithuanian Jews. And he was mostly raised by the sister. We showed you the picture. His father, he describes as being very permissive for a rabbi, in the sense that he wanted Judaism to really work for people, not the other way around, kind of like Rabbi Alex and Rabbi Amy. And a cousin told me that he was known, my grandfather was known as the Red Rabbi. My dad in his story calls him the Berliner Rabbi. And if you understand the different tensions between different groups of Jews in Europe, I think you'll understand that was actually a derogatory term. And which troubled my father because he recalled his father as being very gentle and wise and thoughtful. In June 1941, the war between Russia and Germany started, and Lithuania was right smack dab in the middle. And as the Nazis approached Shkudville at an age where we send our kids to college, that's their initiation into life, my grandfather told my father, take this pocket watch, you're young, you got to run away, you'll be in trouble. I'm an old man, you're not going to want to bother with me. And he rode on his English bike, on which my dad was very proud, and he ran away. And imagine sending your 18-year-old son off at that age. Dad chose to follow his father's advice. He fled and never to see his family or what remained of it in Lithuania again, and went to stay with cousins in a town called Shavel. He learned that his family, his father, his sister, his brother-in-law and little niece were murdered by the Nazis shortly after he had left. Ultimately, the escape was very temporary. The Nazis came to Shavel too, and my dad was rounded up with his cousin Dov Shalansky, who later became a speaker of the Knesset, and threw them into a prison where they spent the summer. I guess by this time we're into and this would have been the summer of 1942. They were forced to work in a garden at some point, where they were forbidden from even touching a blade of grass. Their mouths were open to see if they had stolen any bit of food or even anything from the garden. And my dad describes it as saying, as humiliating as it was somewhat encouraging and hopeful because it reminded them that there was still a world outside. And that's another theme, is he stops and remarks, at least in recollection, that there was always a world that he hoped to rejoin in some normal way later on. Eventually, he was released from prison. His cousin, Dov's sister, had bribed a German officer to release my dad. I'm saying he was needed to work in a jewelry shop. And my dad describes what happened after he left the prison. He had to shave all the hair off his head and body because he was crawling with lice. But somehow that didn't lose hope. Shortly thereafter, the Jews of Shavel were herded into a ghetto, which was surrounded by barbed wire. And the Judenrat in Shavel assigned everybody to work. My dad was assigned to work for a Lithuanian jeweler, which again served him well because he later became a watchmaker. But again, my dad describes what it was like living in the ghetto. They were rationed food, and Jews would be hanged for stealing food, for finding bread that they weren't supposed to have in their pocket. And at this time, he began to hear stories about Jews being lined up and being forced to dig their own graves and then shot. And he recollects that he vowed to himself that this must not happen to me. His will to live was so strong. Despite the horror going around him, he was always thinking, moving ahead. Later, the Nazis began to round up first the children, then the sick people, then the old people, probably sending them to extermination camps. Dad was fortunate, I suppose, and he was sent to a labor camp in the summer of 1942. Again, it was out in the countryside, and that seemed to boost his morale. And when I think about him later in life, he always enjoyed being in the outdoors and watching the flowers bloom and the trees budding, and it always made him feel so good. And it seems, going back to this time, that there was some hope of life continuing. After the summer of 1942, he was sent back to Shavel, and it's at this time that he starts talking, at least in his story, about connecting with other people to join the resistance. It's unclear to me what happened, what kind of connections he made, who he talked to, but somewhat after that time, he was sent to another forced labor camp called Daugel, where bricks were being manufactured. And he was assigned to work for a really gruff Lithuanian named Jurgis, who started, everybody hated Jurgis. He'd foul mouth and he swore at everybody. He evidently made moonshine, which he traded for food. And he started sharing it with my father, who was a Jew, but he didn't seem to bother him. And after a while, they got along. And then out of the blue, Jurgis offers my father a gun and helped to run away. And again, by the time you knew my dad, it's kind of hard to picture this maybe, but we'll show you later a picture of what he kind of looked like at this period. And then you can, he was rather dashing actually. But one night, with Jurgis's help, my dad crawled out of this forced labor camp. And with help of some Lithuanians, he left town in a wagon dressed as a Lithuanian farmer or peasant. And he met up with a partisan group that he stayed with for the remainder of the war. And it's unclear what this partisan group He describes that they held a town briefly, they slept in barns, and it was almost like it was an adventure story. Occasionally they would get grenades and throw them, according to my dad. But he stayed with the resistance until the end of the war. And he was so proud of his participation with this resistance group that we put it on his tombstone, because I think that was to him the most significant thing about himself, that he resisted. He was not a victim. After the war, he passed through a displaced persons camp, and unknown to him at the time, my mother was at the same one trying to connect with her father. He did obtain a visa to the United States by craft. I guess I can tell this now. He said on his visa application that he was from Munich, or from Königsberg, Germany, which was a little island in the middle of Germany, in the middle of Lithuania. He figured nobody could find out because the town was destroyed. And so on his passport, it said he was born in Germany, which wasn't true. And when I put it on his death certificate, my mother got worried that he was going to get deported, but I think it was too late by then. But he was always very careful about that particular. And he was sponsored by an uncle in Altoona who brought him to the United States. He moved to Pittsburgh. He borrowed money for watchmaker tools and set up a business. Sonia, do you want to share any of your reflections?
Sure. I guess the thing that you pointed out most that I remember Grandpa as being is very proud. I hope I'm allowed to say this on here, but he was very comfortable with being a badass. He was very well aware that that's who he was, and he was proud of it. And I said that to him once, and he looked at me and he's like, you know what? I am a badass. And like, I don't really know if he knew what that meant, but I think he got the sentiment. And that pride really came through. But the other thing that I always remember about him telling his story is that he often would tell these like very specific detailed memories of completely random people that chose to help him. And he had to take so many risks, and so many of those risks were trusting people that he didn't know. And fortunately, it really worked out for him, but he always gave these people credit. And what blows my mind is how all of these different scenarios, there were like 1,000 different contingencies that all had to work out perfectly in order for him to survive and be able to be a part of this resistance. And for some reason, they always did. Things worked out for my grandpa so that he was willing to keep taking those risks and do something that he was actually very proud of. And I do think that, you know, he saw the good in people. I think that was his way of making that statement. And I think that he knew he had to pay it forward in some capacity. He knew that he was given so many wonderful gifts from people, and he wanted to do the same thing. Sometimes not in the mechanism that I would like. He offered me his dining room table like 1,000 different times when I bought my first house, and it was ugly. So I said no, but he would do anything to help somebody because so many people did anything they could to help him. And I really think that he recognized that. But the thing I remember most is how much he loved being treated like a rock star whenever I dragged him to all my classrooms and all these different speaking engagements, because I thought it was important to show that strength of him that persisted through such an incredibly dark time. And that was my memory of him. He fortunately softened slightly by the time his grandparents arrived. Grandchildren, sorry. But not too much. He still was exactly who he was, but he definitely played with us probably a little more happily than he played with my mom and her siblings. But no, he was a lot of fun, but he was still exactly who he was. And that's how I remember him.
And yeah, he was a badass, and growing up, he expected us to be badasses too, I think. So, huh?
I gotta go.
Okay, that's okay. So that's my dad. He resisted. And again, afterwards, he never showed any bitterness. The house that we showed, and I can't get it back because Sonia had to step away and get her son who's waking up. A cousin of mine said to me, "Oh, Tybee, you're an American lawyer. Can't you do something to get compensation for the house in Lithuania?" And I said, "Well, I'll only do that if my dad wants me to." At that point, my dad was the only remaining brother. And I said, "Are you interested in the house, in trying to get money for the house in Lithuania?" And he looked at me and he said, "You know, that's crazy. They can keep that house. I'm much better here." And yeah, that was the house. And he just never looked back. He always looked forward. And I think he embraced his life after the war. Despite his being hard on us, he really embraced it. And when the grandchildren came along, he embraced them as well. I'm going to talk now a little bit about my mother and tell, again, pieces of her story. I was working from her first unedited manuscript describing her experiences. And the first part of the manuscript, she developed really well. And then and this part, again, many of you thought of her as being a very sweet woman. That was the comment people made to me. And I would always think to myself, she wasn't sweet. She was a tough lady. And again, when you see the horrors that she suffered, it's understandable why she was so tough. She was, and she, unlike my father, was very ambivalent about telling her story at all. And only when her grandchildren encouraged her to speak to groups of students did she start to share. She was born in a town called Pabianice, Poland in 1924. And this part of the story she enjoyed telling. She was born into a well-to-do family near Lodz, which is a big textile town, it was. She was very proud of the fact that she was well educated. And looking back, she attended a Beit Yaakov school, which some of you may know. It was set up to provide a Jewish education for girls, which again was a very progressive idea at the time because some Orthodox Jews didn't think it was necessary to educate their children, but both apparently my grandfather and grandmother, after whom I'm named, encouraged a strong education in their daughters. They had 3 girls and a little boy. My mother was the oldest.
Can you pull up the pictures?
Sure. Sonia's going to show you pictures.
You can keep talking though.
Oh, okay. And at one point, she was accepted into a gymnasium right before the war. That's my dad's house. This is my grandmother, after whom I'm named. And that's my grandfather, with whom, who survived the whole war and came to the United States with my mother. What's next? This is the synagogue in Pabianice, where they lived. That isn't there anymore. That's just a street. Again, this is before the war. It was, you know, these beautiful promenades, just like you see in European cities today. That was her class at age, her kindergarten class. And sadly, it would take me a few minutes to locate my mother. But she recalls in this period she was singing, this is when the Jews were kicked out of Pabianice and sent to Lodz.
Okay, I'm gonna exit out because the rest of it is for the end.
Okay. But anyway, she was accepted to gymnasium, which was like a private high school, and she excelled in all her subjects. She talks about performing and singing, and she was really, it sounds like, just a bright young woman, and she was very proud of that. She had to commute to Lodz, where she went to gymnasium, and that, you know, after leading a pretty cloistered life, it seemed to have broadened her experiences. The family spent summers at a resort, swimming, hiking, biking. A grandmother who owned a store and was very independent. Again, we're talking about the 20s in Europe in an Orthodox community. They were Hasidic, owned a store, but lived with them. And she liked to tell that part of the story. And she often liked, as we were growing up, to compare our lives growing up to the life that she had as a young girl before the war. Of course, all that changed when the Nazis invaded Poland in 1939. And from here on forward, the way she tells the story, it's a story of survival, sort of passive survival, the way she remembers it. But when you really hear what happened, you know that she must have been more active in her decision to continue living and survive. It wasn't just survival, it was something more. After the Nazis invaded Poland, her family was forced into a ghetto in Pabianice. Her uncle Avram, whose second family of kids I've gotten to know, they live in Israel now, moved in with them, and together they all helped to manage and survive. And one of the things she keeps saying is that as long as the family's together, we'll survive this. That was an important theme in her story. As long as we're together, we will survive. She dreamed of going to Israel, where it would be a different world, where Jews wouldn't be singled out. But she, to some degree, even in the ghetto, she was able to get together with her friends and share these kinds of dreams. Her father and her uncle Abram were very resourceful. Abram had been an electrician, and they were very resourceful in using their skills to sell electrical appliances or exchange them for food. So they managed to have, not lots to eat, but enough to eat. Briefly in this, briefly in this period, she talks a little bit about making a cake with coffee grounds and potato peels, and how her father tried to keep things normal, tried to make things. Sonia has a recollection of her father making matzah in the ghetto during Passover, but to somehow keep these traditions alive despite the abysmal circumstances. Is Corbin ready to make his appearance?
He might start singing his song.
Okay, Corbin may start singing in the background, and
there he goes, right on cue.
If it interferes, just let us know, and we'll take him into another room. But I don't want to let him go. Briefly in this time frame, her father and two sisters went to a town called Kilse, which my mother says was in the protectorate, but I couldn't verify that. It appeared to be a town in the center of the resistance. They thought somehow they would do better there. The plan, I think, was for my mother, her mother, and her younger brother to join them, but it didn't work out. Kilse was, I believe, eventually decimated, and they came back to Pabianice. My mother worked in a tailor shop. She recalls being very clumsy at first, and she needed help from others. But eventually she became very proficient. And when we were growing up, she often sewed our clothes. It often pained me to recall how she learned and under what circumstances she learned to sew. But she was an excellent seamstress until she was really very old and could barely see. On May 16th, 1942, the Jews of Pabianice were divided into two groups. She, along with her father and her older sister, were in the A group, and they were resettled into the Lodge Ghetto, where they lived with my grandfather, her father's relatives. Her mother, brother, and younger sister were sent away. And of course, nobody knew at the time, but it was a transport to Chelmno, where they were likely gassed in the gas chambers in Chelmno. She told me that in this period, she often ached and cried for her mother. The loss of her family was just so incredibly painful. And it certainly explains how she treated us. Unlike my father, who sent us off and wanted us to be independent, she was very protective of us and hated it even when I went off to college or something. She hated to let me go. But somehow they managed to survive in the Lodge Ghetto, which was, you hear a lot of stories about how cruel it is, but she doesn't talk about that. She talked about the various jobs and how that she was able to hold. Her father was carefully rationed the food so they would always have enough to eat, and tried to keep their lives. The word she used is somewhat normal. And, of course, today we wonder what's normal, what's not normal. And she had the same questions about, going back to that time in her life. And she often repeated this to me, that she told of sleeping every chance she got. And she thinks she survived the war by sort of sleeping through it, which sounds sort of improbable to me. But that's the way she remembers it. In 1944, the Nazis began to liquidate the Lodz ghetto. They hid, but they were found by August and transported to Auschwitz. Somehow there was a selection process there too, and which she recalls as being surreal is my word, not hers. But she always recounts her time in Auschwitz as though she were outside looking in. And one thing she told me once is that, people were real skinny and had shaved heads. They looked like monkeys. And she couldn't believe that she too one day would be one of those monkeys.
That's right, a monkey.
And, but she got through, she survived Auschwitz somehow, and she seemed unaware of the gas chambers there. After Auschwitz, where she was for maybe 3 weeks, she was sent to a forced labor camp in Freiburg, Germany. It seemed to be make work. This is very close to the end of the war. And a month or two before the end of the war, my mom and her sister, who was still alive, were sent in open cattle cars to Mauthausen, where shortly thereafter they were liberated by the Americans. Sadly, after surviving the whole ordeal of the war, her sister died from what her mom believes was tuberculosis. And mom describes feeling just completely hopeless at that point. How did I make it this far with my sister only to have her die? What's left for me? But despite all that, and this is where the strength comes in, she gathered her wits about her, located her father, who she thought was in Munich, and somehow got herself from Mauthausen in Austria to Germany, which was no mean feat because there were borders to cross. As you may recall, Europe was divided up among the Allies. She had to go from one region, one zone to another. She had to bribe people. She didn't have any money. I don't quite know how she managed it, but a person who's hopeless and given up doesn't do that. So despite her remembering that she was just a survivor, she was an intelligent, capable woman and somehow got herself to Munich, and then ultimately met up with her father in Fildefink, this displaced person camps where, again, unknown to her, my father was also staying there at the time. Mom wanted to go to Israel after the war, but her father said, I have 4 uncles in Paterson, New Jersey, and that's where we're going. And that's where they ended up. And in this very early version of her story, she depicts herself as just surviving the war and wonders why she didn't resist war. So, and that's a question I can't answer now, but there was a strength there, which I don't think she ever recognized in herself. She eventually met my dad at a picnic in Spring Valley, New York, and they married shortly thereafter.
Wedding picture? Wedding picture?
Yeah. So we'll show you a picture of them.
Corbin, can you go with Dada?
They look like a Hollywood couple, in my opinion. Not that,
Well,
not
not
that one. Yeah, that's them when they got married. That's their wedding picture. And my dad is pretty dashing. My mother, I think, looked pretty glamorous. And
Those shoes.
yeah, look at those shoes. I couldn't wear those. So I think they look sort of Hollywoodish.
And this is how I remember them.
And this is them, of course, much later in life when they were speaking to one of Sonia's classroom full of students. Is that your students?
No,
or is
those are
those are in
Rachel
South
and Molly's
Carolina. Yeah.
My cousin's class.
Okay. So what do you want to say about grandma?
Especially right after she died, so many people came to me and, obviously offered their condolences and talked about what a sweet lady she was. And my mom and I always joke, like, oh, you must not have known her that well. Because I mean, I guess she could be sweet, but she had more grit than that. And she was sassy, she was spunky, and she was incredibly smart. And I think a large part of that is because how much she valued her education. She was incredibly well read. And she took pride in the fact that she was, and she always wanted to make sure that you knew that she was no dummy. She wasn't just some sweet little old lady. And I don't know, I really like that about her. The last few years of her life, she really became my best friend. I could really tell her anything, things I couldn't even tell my mom. And it would be funny. We would always say stuff to each other. Like, I'd be like, don't tell mom. She'd be like, don't tell Tybee. And she was amazing. And with the stuff that my mom kept pointing out that, you know, she kind of has like no idea how she survived this thing. And I do. It's because she was brilliant. She was courageous. She didn't just take it. She didn't think that she resisted. She didn't think that she fought back. But when you look back and see the journey that she had to take, not just through the war, but in the years following and in creating a family out of nothing, I think she did that. And I don't think she was as proud of herself as everybody else was proud of her. But yeah, she was a cool lady. And I think that sweet doesn't do her justice. And that's what I like to say about her. Sorry about all the secrets we kept from you, Mom.
Can you tell me now?
No.
Tybee, I know when you and I were talking, you were saying that you felt like your parents' experience in the Holocaust influenced how you were raised Jewishly, and also then how you raised your family. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that as well.
Kind of what I said and how I feel is that in my upbringing, particularly as I got older, being Jewish was very much wrapped up in was wrapped up with the Holocaust experience. And it was almost a negative thing. And there were some other issues as well, but it was something that was plotting, which was sort of inconsistent with how each of them described their own Jewish upbringing. But what kind of they transmitted to us was, you know, being Jewish is a heavy, miserable burden that can get you murdered. And I really struggled with trying to strip that out of whatever I was transmitting to my children. My father was an atheist. I mean, he really didn't believe in God, but he believed in being Jewish. And my mother, I don't know what her belief in God was. I don't think she could have articulated it, but she believed in being Jewish. And what I tried to transmit to my kids was something joyful and meaningful out of it, and not a burden to be carried around, because nobody really wants that.
I wanted to share one of the questions, whenever I drag my grandparents around to speaking engagements and to talk to all my students year after year after year after year, a question that was almost always asked, especially to my grandmother, because she was in the camps, was, you know, why didn't it occur to her to like say she wasn't Jewish? And the cool thing about my grandma is that like she genuinely did not understand the question. Like that wasn't, she was like, that's not, what? It was just such a part of her identity. And that's the part of her identity that she took with her and continued and certainly made an impression on us. I'm assuming she made the same impression on you. But it was just something completely unfathomable that she couldn't even comprehend. And I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, we had the honor to know your parents, your mom, much longer, but she was quite a lady. She really was. And it's been such an honor to hear your story. I wanted to ask you if you would share with us, what do you think that your parents would want us to take away from their story?
Well, from my father's story, again, he didn't look back. He wasn't bitter. And he made a life for himself, and something about rising above adversity. There's always a world out there, and they treasured whatever they had in the United States. So I think that's the lesson that he wanted to learn.
Always a solution.
Right. My mother, I think, particularly if she looked back on her experiences, family became the most important thing. Can you bring Corbin in here? He's part of this answer.
Oh, he's gonna be so loud. Obnoxious.
Hopefully we're towards the end of this, but when in her last, I don't know, some of you had some dealings with her in her last year of life when she was in a lot of pain. And, life was almost not worth living anymore. But Sonia would bring her son over and she would say to him, "You're such a lucky little boy." And she was not one, she didn't want to brag. But you're such a lucky little boy because you were born into this wonderful family. And she was really proud of the fact that she and my dad started something from nothing and created, she was tremendously proud of us, but didn't want to give us, the evil eye, Kanahora. And she would say to Corbin, "You're such a lucky little boy. You have such a wonderful family."
No,
He's denying it as kids.
no,
will
he's
do.
he's trying to read his favorite book, which is this like 3-month-old edition of National Geographic that's all about trash.
So I think Corbin is the answer to your question with regard to my mom.
Can you say hi?
Hi, Corbin. Yeah, when it seems like such a large part of their story was after the Holocaust and all that they created with your family. Do you have anything that you wanted to?
Well, we got a lot of
ask or add?
questions from the group. I guess so many of the survivors didn't tell their story. It sounds like you knew that story at a young age. I mean, did they tell you their story when you were a child? You were a teenager? When did you hear this? When did they start talking to you about their stories?
I would say well after we were grown up and gone, did we really hear it. Now, it's not like we didn't know something had happened. When we were young, she talked about her life in Europe. My mother was from Europe, which sort of meant something. But we knew something was up, and that this is an experience that I've shared with other children of survivors, where you didn't know the specifics of it, but we knew there was something. The specifics we learned much later, and we read in these stories. And again, I offered to, these are unedited. So somebody typed them, but they're really in my parents' own words. Some of them are only reasonably well organized, but my father will stop with these philosophical observations. And it's my favorite version of the story because I can hear their voices in it. And I'd be happy to share them with you so you can share them with others. But no, we didn't know the specifics until much later.
Thank you. Well, we can see that Corbin has had enough. But before, I really want to thank you on behalf of everyone, because it's really been such a way to honor and to remember Yom HaShoah by remembering your parents and hearing their story. And so before we light a candle together, I thought we could just say a prayer, and I'll say it on our behalf. We remember the victims of the Holocaust, the young, the old, the 1.5 million children murdered because they were deemed guilty of the crime of being different. We remember what happens when hate takes hold of the human heart and turns it to stone. What happens when victims cry for help and there is no one listening. We remember and pay tribute to the survivors who bore witness to what happened and the victims, so that robbed of their lives, they would not also be robbed of their deaths. Adonai, we call on you to help us hear your voice that says in every generation, do not murder, do not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor, do not oppress the stranger. And we know that while we do not have the ability to change the past, we can change the future. We know that while we cannot bring the dead back to life, we can ensure their memories live on. And so as we light this candle, we commit ourselves to one simple act, Yizkor, remember. May the souls of the victims be bound up in the bond of everlasting life, and let us say, Amen. please join us as we sing Oseh Shalom together. Oseh Shalom bimroman, Uyaseh Shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'yimru, amen. Oseh Shalom bimroman, Uyaseh Shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'yimru, amen. So we're gonna unmute everyone in just a moment, so you can say goodbye, shalom to each other. Thank Tybee and Sonia. They will, Tybee will, if you'd like to read her parents' memoirs, please just let us know and we can pass it along to you. And thank you so much for being with us, everyone.
So Yom HaShalom.
Rabbi,
Yes.
how come we didn't get any candles? We don't have any, it's Myron.
Mark, you read the email from this morning. It's
Yeah. They couldn't.
we couldn't get it out.
Yeah, Men's Club could not get the candle out.
Yeah.
But what they did is they, in the email that we received
This morning.
this morning, there's a prayer from Men's Club. If you'd like to recite that prayer, and if you just have another candle, it doesn't have to be a candle from a Yizkor candle. But if you have another candle, just like we did other things for Passover, feel free to light another candle in memory of those that perished.
They tried hard to get the candles, social distancing. You couldn't get the people, the volunteers.
I don't want
If I can say, not to interrupt anybody else, you two are the best. You're both my heroes. I love you both.
Aaron, you're our hero, so you're good.
And thank you. And next week, actually.
Oh, next week. That's right. The email said the 20th. If you haven't figured it out, that meant the 27th. Yes.
Next week is Yom HaZikaron, which is the day that we remember Israel's fallen, and it goes right from Yom HaZikaron into Yom HaAtzmaut, into Israel Independence Day. And we're going to have Maura Rosenfeld with us, who made and Stephen Ryback. So we'll have different generations to celebrate and Israel. So we hope you'll join us for that as well.
That's right. Tonight's services are at 6 p.m. Tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. We have Adult Ed. We have Thursday afternoon Christian Jewish Dialogue. Torah Yoga's on Friday. We have a special service on Saturday honoring the memory of Nikki Gordon. We have Torah study. Boomers have an event on Sunday. So we have some events coming up. Please look at your email from tomorrow night. Last night. And also look for the daily emails for the individual events. Okay.
That's it. Thanks so much
Thank
for
you.
joining us. Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Oh, nice to see so many people. Everybody stay well.
Thank Tybee and
Be
Sonia.
well. Thank you, Tybee and Sonia.
You're very welcome.
Corbin.
So glad he got to make an appearance.
He's off onto something else, though.
He can sing all he wants. Yeah.
We can't wait to have him back in religious school. Sonia is one of our awesome religious school teachers.
Terrific.
And when Tybee's not babysitting, we get Corbin.
Yeah,
so
How old is Corbin?
He's about 22 months.
Oh, he is just. I'm not surprised you didn't want him to leave the room. I wouldn't want him to leave the room either. He's
and it was
wonderful.
Really hearing your story, I think, while he's there, because it's the other side.
And she really treasured all her grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Unfortunately, my dad died before any of the great-grandchildren were born. But, and I think she would have died earlier, except that she lived She said, she would say, I'm gonna keep living because otherwise I'll miss you or something like that.
Mm, no.
Everyone stay safe, stay inside unless you're in the sun by yourself, Eileen, that's okay too. Please, stay
Okay.
vigilant. We're gonna.
Yes, everyone be well.
Bless you.
Take care. Thank you.
Fence this and that and the other.
You know how we feel about you.
What's that?
Okay.